Hello, my quilting friends. My name is Leah Day, and this month I have a super exciting quilting tutorial for you. First up, this beautiful bright rainbow quilt behind me, this is Rainbow Road, and it's basically just a jelly roll quilt. You take 2.5-inch strips, sew them all together to make one big giant super strip, then you cut it up and piece it together in rows in order to make these color blocks. So you can find the free quilt pattern to piece up your own Rainbow Road quilt top at leahday.com/rainbow road. But together this month, we are actually not going to piece it. I know that's what we usually do. We usually piece a quilt top together, but instead we're gonna quilt it, and we're gonna quilt it with something really cool, with specially printed backing fabric. So this is a design that I came up with last summer, and I had the idea to make the fabric many months ago. So this is Twisted Squares fabric. You can find it at spoonflower.com, and I'll make sure to link it up below the video so you can easily find it. So basically it is the Twisted Squares design printed on fabric, and I have printed mine on Minky, so it's super soft. And we're gonna quilt this quilt in reverse. So this is the quilt top, this is the backing, but we're gonna quilt it from this side and stitch it together, both on a home sewing machine and on a long arm. So let's get started making the Twisted Squares / Rainbow Road quilt together. So I'm getting started, and as you can see, I have taken my Rainbow Road quilt and it is basted on the back side. And then I've taken my Twisted Square fabric and it is basted on the right side. So this is reversing the way I normally quilt, and this is the backing. So I'm going to be quilting it from the back. Now I did base this on my long arm using water-soluble thread, so that way I didn't have any pins to deal with. You can check out a video on how to do that in a quilting workshop that I taught, and that is Basting Basics. So definitely come and check that out and learn how to baste a quilt with me. So I'm getting started just pulling up thread here right in the center of the quilt, right along one of those twisted square shapes. And I'm just going to shift the quilt around and get comfortable, just make sure that it's nice and fluffy and easy to move around. I also want to make sure that you can see what I'm doing, all that good stuff. So there we go, that's feeling pretty good. It's always good to just take a second to check in on how your body feels. I was feeling like I was resting just a little low on my chair, so I just cranked up just a bit. There we go, that feels good. Okay, so I'm gonna just get started quilting along this orange square first. I think that's a good place to start. So I'm just gonna stitch down. And Twisted Squares is such a fun design. You basically start with a square and then you're stitching more squares into that square, but just at a very slight angle. So that way it begins to look like it's not necessarily straight lines. It starts to look like there's curves there. Now I am doing this with free motion quilting, but of course you could do this with walking foot quilting too. That's totally open to you. I am going to rotate, at least at first, until I get the feel for having, this is actually Minky fabric that I had this printed on. So I am actually going to just get the feel for it first and rotate just a little bit more often so that way I can get the hang of it. Okay, I'll rotate it back and stitch straight back. Let's see if I can do this. I can't really see what's behind me. I'm just going to try and stay on that orange line. There we go. This is a little harder than usual because it's actually turned out to be a fairly large quilt, and it's just a bit bigger than I was expecting. And then of course it's an adventure quilting it upside down. I don't really know how this is going to turn out. There we go. Now I'm stitching along the orange lines, and it is a good bit of rotation. You might be wondering, why are you shifting so much when you're quilting with free motion quilting? Free motion quilting is supposed to go in all directions. So let me give this a try. I'm going to try and stitch sideways. I very rarely stitch sideways, just simply because I prefer to rotate. So let's see if I can do this. I know I already formed some pretty big stitches, but that's okay. It's not the end of the world. There we go. It just feels kind of awkward. So it's not my preference to quilt that way, because it feels slightly awkward, but it's absolutely possible, and maybe it's just a little faster because I'm not having to shift the quilt around in order to face the right direction, in order to face towards me or directly behind. Now, the nice thing I gotta say about the Minky is hiding a lot of my quilting mistakes, and I have been quilting with Minky quite a bit lately on the back of my quilt, not really on the front. This is the first time I'm trying this on the front of my quilt, and Minky has a pile, as you can see. It's got this texture kind of like a stuffed animal, and that pile really hides your quilting thread. It kind of creates a channel where your quilting threads, you really just can't see them. Now if I flip it up and look on the back of the quilt, well, I'm on a yellow section, so you can't see anything anyway, because I'm quilting with white thread here. So this is going to be interesting. I really don't know what to expect because it's going to have this quilting design, the quilting design from the backing fabric coming over onto the front, and I really have no idea what this is gonna look like. It's gonna look like an all-over quilting design, of course, and it's gonna have this twisted square design with it, but other than that, I really don't know what to expect. So now I'm gonna stitch down and start that loop around the green. All right, coming around, home stretch here, connecting with that last little purple line. Well, let's see, do I want to do anything in there? Whatever I do in this first one, I have to do in all of them, so I have to kind of think about it. Well, I guess I could kind of play with a different design in every one. That would be fun. I'm going to swirl around with some stippling. Stippling is that oldie goldie design. First design I ever learned how to free motion quilts. That looks great. And you can find a new tutorial I've just updated, and I actually shared this one on the home sewing machine and on the Longarm, so you can see how to quilt it on both types of machines, and you can find that tutorial at leahday.com/stippling. So definitely go check that out too. Okay, that looks cool. Minky's kind of doing some funky stuff, but hey, I think that's pretty neat. And I love that nice puff of texture that we're getting from that twisted square design. So there's our pretty quilt block, nicely quilted, and as you can see, this is going to take a little while. I've got some white lines here on the fabric that I'm going to stitch along. I might switch to my walking foot for that, and then I'm going to try quilting from the purple to the outside and see if that goes just a little bit faster with free motion quilting. But yeah, it's going to take a little while. It's going to be a fun experiment just to see what this looks like on both sides of the quilt. Already, I can tell you, I love the look of this on the back. I love that slight puff I'm getting from the Minky and from my batting, and I can't wait to see what it's going to look like on the other side of the quilt too. So I'll meet you back here when I've done a lot more quilting and have something to show you. So I quilted quite a bit of twisted squares on my home sewing machine, and it really just got pretty slow. The pattern that I began stitching was to stitch the largest purple square and go outward, then to connect to the next square and quilt it to the inside. So I could chain two squares together, but it was still a little slow, and especially with the fluffy Minky fabric, you know, it was just one of those things. I really wanted to be able to finish this quilt up so that way you could see what it looked like on both sides completely finished. So I decided to move it over here to my Longarm. This is the Grace Unique 14 Plus, or these days it's been renamed to the 15R, which means it has a stitch regulator. So the machine is going to be doing the work for me as far as forming the stitches. And as far as control goes, that's the hard thing on a Longarm, because now I'm moving the machine and not the quilt. I'm going to use a quilting ruler that I've designed for Grace Company, and that's going to help me control it and make these lines nice and straight. And you'll be able to find this ruler on my website starting in April 2018. So I hope you'll come and check it out at leahday.com/slice. This is the slice ruler. Okay, so we're going to get started here, and I'm going to show you how to quilt twisted squares on the Longarm as well. So I'm going to position the machine here right on the corner of that purple square, and I'm just hitting the button that drops the needle down and back up again, and that will bring my bobbin thread up to the surface. Now I'm going to hang on to those thread tails as I drop it back down again and just kind of tuck that out of my way. There we go. Okay, so this is the slice ruler. I'm going to push this up right against the foot, and then I'm just guesstimating space here. I'm trying to aim to have the edge of this ruler about 1/4 inch away from that printed line on the fabric. Okay, so this is my non-dominant hand that's holding the ruler, and then my dominant hand is clicking the button and actually steering the machine. So I'm left-handed, so I'm steering the machine with my left hand and holding the ruler with my right hand. Okay, so I've done enough of these to know that I really like it when the fat end of the ruler is kind of towards the back. And as you can see, we can't rotate the quilt, we just rotate the ruler around to make all of these straight lines. So here I'm coming over here, and I do click the machine off every time I'm changing direction because I don't want it to continue to stitch in place. Anytime that the machine senses movement, that's the stitch regulator that is going to continue to stitch. So if it senses even just a little bit of a wiggle of a movement, it's going to continue to tell the needle to drop up and down. And so that's why I'm clicking that button. You'll hear that beep every time I stop because I don't want it bouncing up and down basically in place. Okay, so I decided to fill all of these purple squares with different designs, and this one's kind of a little wiggly grid almost. I'm going to wiggle up and down and then side to side. So kind of think a checkerboard only with wiggles. Now I'm going to go back up and down, and then now to the side. It was just kind of fun to play around with different designs and see what I could do in this small space. I'm not aiming for it to be perfect, but it ended up being a nice way to practice lots of quilting designs, and just figure out what is easy to quilt on the long arm. And I just totally messed this up, and that's okay. It's not really fitting with the rest of them, but hey, that's also stippling, so it doesn't really matter. Okay, so now I'm going to work my way around the blue. So I'm going to be quilting on those blue lines. So now I'm lining up the ruler, and I have to kind of just eyeball it really well. So it helps to have the needle down, so that way I know I'm right in that right position, so I can push the ruler up against the foot, and that helps out a lot. And then I'm just eyeballing this. I want this distance to remain 1/4 inch, and then back here to be 1/4 inch too. So I'm going to hold this down firmly, so I'm pressing down onto the quilt and also against the foot at the same time. I'm going to pull the machine towards me, and then I'm going to back it up. Why am I doing that? Because the ruler is already in position, and I know I will need to quilt that little line. I'm going to go all the way around, and if I did not stitch that little line, then it would not be stitched whenever I started the green. So yeah, it took me a little while to figure that out. I left a few little 1-inch sections open on a few blocks, and then I realized, okay, I need to do a little back up there, and then it'll get me started, and I can go all the way around the square. And this is interesting. This is totally different from the way Twisted Squares is actually quilted when you stitch it as a free hand design. When you stitch it without any marks, obviously without any printed fabric, then this is the opposite. You're going to quilt that design from the inside of your square, the outside of your square to the inside. You can't quilt it the other way because obviously you wouldn't have anything to go off of. You wouldn't have any guidelines to base it on. So this will only work whenever you're working on printed fabric or you've marked the design on your quilt. And I find that really fun. It's really fun to experiment with this, printing the design on fabric and seeing what happens, and then also experimenting with quilting in reverse and just seeing how this is going to go. Okay, so you can see I did that little backup section again on the green. Click my button again here. Now what happens when you get off? What happens when the ruler, is kind of tilted to the side? Well, visually I can start to see it. I see the needle veering away from where I want it to be, and I just angle that ruler to get it back on track. I'm not going to rip it out. It's not going to be super noticeable on the other side. What I do try and be careful about is where these points are coming in. I do try not to overshoot my points. Like if I had stitched further out into the orange, I try not to do that. But, again, this is quilting in reverse. There's not really a lot of control over how this is going to look on the right side of the quilt. We can only see this side of the quilt. So you have to give up a little bit of that control and perfection that is sometimes so nice to have when we're quilting normally. The nice thing is, with the Minky fabric that I'm using, I find that the stitches really can tuck down and hide, so little stitch issues, you know, wobbles and stuff like that, tends to get hidden inside the layers of the Minky. Okay, so again here, if I stitch all the way around, I'll come out right here and I'll start my orange row without stitching that little bit of yellow. So I'm going to get my ruler in position, stitch back, and then leaving my ruler in position, stitch forward. So that ensures, I think, pretty perfect travel stitching. I won't know till I flip it over and look on the other side of the quilt, but that seems to work for me. And I'd rather go ahead and knock that out without having to shift the ruler than doing it a different way. Okay, so here we go. I like the yellow. I'm using white isocord thread here, and the yellow almost blends completely. So I kind of feel like, okay, here's where I can make mistakes. You know, if I've got any mistakes that need to happen, let's do it in the yellow. Nowhere else. Like, that really works, you know, telling myself to only make mistakes in one place. All right, here we go. When the lines start to get longer, of course, it just becomes a little bit more tricky. You just want to watch that ruler and just eyeball that distance, so that way you can stitch that line nice and straight. And like I said, you can just tilt a ruler, just rotate it ever so slightly. If it starts to look like it's getting off, then just shift that over just a bit, no big deal. There we go. And rotate again. There we go. And I hope you can see just how much faster this is because I'm not having to move the quilts. This is just moving the ruler. I'm not having to shift the quilt around and bunch it through the arm of the machine, all that good stuff. Although, you know, I quilted a good chunk of this. I quilted about 22 blocks on my home machine and I was loving it. It's lots and lots of fun. I tried ruler work on my home machine too, and that was working out great. But, you know, when time is an issue, I gotta say, you know, moving the machine instead of moving the quilt does feel faster. Okay, so we're on the last leg, and this is the longest lines in the quilt, and they're about 7 inches long, and my ruler, I know, is exactly 7 inches long. That's going to push it, because you can see here, I like to have at least a half of an inch of overhang or so that way my foot doesn't slip. So I'm going to have to reposition the ruler halfway through the line. So here we go. We're going to start out stitching, get to about the halfway point, then stop, move the ruler, and begin again. The key there, I think, is continue pressing the ruler against the ruler foot. And that's another really important key. You have got to have a high base ruler foot and be using the thicker 1/4 inch rulers when you're working on a long arm, because the long arm foot hops. You can see this when I click it. You see that little hopping? If you use the thinner rulers or a thinner foot base, then it could potentially hop on top of the edge of the ruler, and then you'd break your needle and it would sound terrible and it'd be really scary. So yeah, always use thick base with thick rulers when you're quilting on a long arm. Different situation when you're quilting on a home machine, but when you're on the long arm, always make sure it's a thick ruler foot and thick template. Okay, coming in on our last line of stitching here. Swinging down, and you can see I can speed up. I've been going pretty slow. And sometimes I'll be like, I don't know if I stitched that. Did I remember to stitch that? And I'll reach underneath the quilt and feel it just to double check myself. And yes, I'm pretty sure that I stitched that little line. It's good to have little habits that keep you in check so you don't accidentally forget and leave something open. Okay, so now I'm going to get to this block back here, because I can simply travel stitch over and stitch this block more in the traditional way that Twisted Squares is quilted, and that is from the inside of the outside of the square to the inside. So here we go. I'm going to try and travel stitch right along that line. And I should add, when I was on my home sewing machine, I went on ahead and stitched virtually in the ditch. We can think of it as in the ditch. That's the white lines that were printed on the fabric between the twisted squares, between each individual 8-inch square. So I stitched vertically and horizontally through all of that, so that way the quilt was mostly secure and stable, and also it just made it easier to travel stitch, between each block. So right now I'm just travel stitching along those lines, and I'm getting back up and into this block now. Okay, so again, positioning my ruler, we're back on those orange lines, and those are the longest that we have to quilt. So I'm going to stitch halfway up, then stop and reposition the ruler and stitch the other half. And the biggest thing I think to keep in mind is just to keep your foot next to your ruler. I can take this and wiggle the machine in all different directions, and it's kind of just a little gentle pressure here between the ruler foot and the ruler at all times. And you might be a little worried, my fingers are pretty close here, and you might be a little worried something might slip. I have true grips on the back of this ruler that is helping to grip the fabric a little bit. I'm also hooking my thumb here over the edge, so I'm putting some pressure here, but I'm not sliding my fingers across the edge, if that makes sense. It feels safe enough, and I haven't had an issue with it yet, and I would certainly share it with you if I did. If I stitch through my finger, I will let you know what happens and why and how I learned. It's one of those things, like I haven't made a mistake that's hurt me yet, and some of that might just simply be experience. And that's how we learn. We make mistakes, we learn from our experience, and we don't make that mistake again, hopefully. Here we go, stitching down. Again, just watch those corners. That's the tricky spot. You don't want to overshoot the corners. But even if you do, it's not that big of a deal. It's not the end of the world. Okay, so we have a little bit of a different situation as we go inside the block whenever we're stitching from the outside in. Now I'm going to line up my ruler with that orange. My ruler was, I hope you saw that, my ruler was kind of slightly popped up on top of the foot rather than down by the side of it, so watch out for that too. Okay, so I'm lining this up, and I'm going to stitch up to the corner of the yellow, trying to travel stitch carefully. There we go. Now I'll line up with the line between the yellow and the orange. So this is how I chain the blocks together. I'm able to quilt 2, going from the inside to the outside on one, going from the outside to the inside on the next one, and that worked out great. Reduced thread breaks down to, 1 every 2 blocks, and as you can see, it definitely sped up as I quilted through each of these twisted squares. So I'm just going to continue stitching along this, working my way into the purple, and then I'll fill that with a different design. I'll break thread and move to that last block in this row. So that's it for this video. I hope you learned a lot. There's a lot of different things that we learned in this video, and I gotta say, I really enjoyed this experience. It was a challenge. Quilting from the back is something I have never tried before, and I really like it. It really breaks down the quilting process to something very simple because, obviously the design is already printed on the fabric, so I didn't have to mark anything. There was a little bit of, just kind of a mental adjustment as far as piecing the quilt top bigger than the back. It's one of those things. This is going to be something that I think works best for really scrappy quilts that don't have a really obvious design. So like I would not put this, over a quilt where I've really intricately pieced something like stars or butterflies or something like that. I would do this over a very scrappy quilt with lots of different colors, something that doesn't have an obvious design where the quilting is really adding that design in. Quilting from reverse, the one thing you want to keep in mind is anytime your machine makes a bad noise, that's usually a sign you're going to get a thread break or a snarl bird's nest, something like that. That's a sign that you need to stop, break thread, pick out your stitches a little bit, because that nasty knot of threads is going to show up on both sides of your quilt. It's going to show up on what would be the right side of your quilt. So make sure to take care of those little things anytime you hear them. Bad noise means stop, and it takes a little while to get into the habit of that. I know I used to be so guilty of continuing to try and keep quilting even when my machine made bad sounds. So it's one of those habits to build, definitely. Now, if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to learn more about the long arm that I am quilting on, this is the Grace Unique, and you can learn more about it at leahday.com/grace. And if you're interested in learning more, please call Grace Company for more information, and make sure to mention that Leah Day said, "Hello, my quilting friends," and they'll give you a nice discount or bonus accessories with your order. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to my channel on YouTube. And come and check out my quilt shop at leahday.com. You can find the tools and supplies that I use in the video. We will have the quilting rulers coming up soon, available both for long arms and for home sewing machines. So this is coming up really soon, and we're going to have lots of fun tutorials to teach you how to use them. And one last thing, don't forget to download the free quilt pattern from leahday.com/rainbow road. Until next time, let's go quilt.